In this video, we're going to go over various ways to request information about standards. And we will end by talking about multi-table standards and how those differ from regular standards. From the Crosswalk demo collection, we'll start under GraphQL. And the most basic request we can make is just to request standards. So in the body of our GraphQL query, we're requesting a list of standards and we're requesting ID and name for those standards. When we make that request, we get a JSON response showing all the standards, including the ID and the name that we requested. If we're looking for a specific standard, the way that we request that is through a GraphQL parameter called named ID, and we pass in the GUID identifier of that standard. So this is useful if you know the ID. For example, if you've selected the list of standards and received the IDs back, and now in your application you want to request further information about a particular standard, you may be passing the ID. But if you're starting from nothing, you may not know the ID, and that may not be as useful. So an alternative to passing in the GUID ID is to pass in the name of the standard, like this, master format. And when we request that, we get back just the master format. And so the way that works is first it will look for a GUID and look up the standard by that. If it does not find it, or if it's not a GUID, it will look up based on the name of the standard and try to match that to the ID. So that's an alternative way to get information about a standard. And if we want to look at classifications within that standard, we would request it the same way by specifying the ID, and we would add classifications. And you can add whatever fields you want about the classification. So this will give you the first level of classifications beneath the master format standard. So we can see electrical is 260000 and so on. We have equivalent examples under the REST interface. So if we want to request standards, that URL would be API/standards. And we would get back the same collection of standards, only we don't have control over the fields that are returned. So we'll get a reasonable collection of fields back, including ID and name. Similarly, we can request a standard by a GUID ID by appending that ID at the end of the URL. Or for similar reasons as before, if we don't know the ID, we can pass in the name of the standard and attempt to receive it that way. Some standards have multiple tables. For example, OmniClass has multiple tables, and all the classifications are within a table rather than being directly within a standard. So when you have a situation like that, then you would request the standard as before, and you can request to see a number of tables within that standard. So when we receive this response back, we can see the standard information, same as before, but we have a collection of tables within that standard. So you can see each table has a number and a name, and then classifications are within that table. So just like we could do with standards, we can request tables by ID. And we do that by specifying the standard ID, like before, and adding a table GUID or a table name. So this lookup operates the same way. First it will look for a GUID identifier and look under the table ID to match. Or if it's not a GUID or it can't find it, it will look for the table by number. So when we search here, this table's number is 13, and we get information about just this table. If we need classifications within a table, then we would have a very similar search as before when we were looking up classifications within a standard, where now we specify an additional parameter named table, and it will only return classifications within that table. So in this video we covered making requests around standards. We looked at the GraphQL API and equivalent calls in the REST API, and we discussed multi-table standards and how to query information about tables and classifications within tables. Thank you.